Welcome back to the School of Muscle podcast. Today, Bryan joins me and we're going to discuss a study that he was an author on titled, Can I Have My Coffee and Drink It? A systematic review and meta-analysis to determine whether habitual caffeine consumption affects the ergogenic effect of caffeine. So that's what we're going to kind of cover today and dive into. And I know that this is a topic I'm particularly interested in, being a regular caffeine consumer. So this will definitely be selfishly pretty interesting for me here. But kind of the first place I'd like to start here, Bryan, is what just kind of led you to want to do this study in the first place?
Nice. Thanks for having me on, Ryan. And I think an important question to start, really, because it's essentially the entire rationale behind the whole study. And I think the answer to that generally always kind of incorporates both the researcher's own interests. So, I myself also had an interest in this as somebody who uses caffeine and does exercise, and then kind of a combination with the current state of the science. So I'd already been researching supplements for about 15 years, and about 10 years ago in our group, we started to look into caffeine and its effects on exercise performance. So, caffeine's one of those supplements that just has a really good body of evidence, to suggest that it works. And it works for pretty much every type of exercise, it seems. Endurance, explosive power, strength training, team sports, you name it, there's evidence that it kind of can improve it. But there are, or at least there were, or still are, I think, some narratives that a number of factors might modify this effect of caffeine, essentially making it maybe more or less effective. And one of those factors is habitual caffeine consumption. Most people wake up and have a nice brew of tea or coffee, which obviously contains caffeine. And so many people suggest that habitual caffeine consumption may generate a kind of tolerance to its effects, reducing its potential benefits for exercise performance. So for us, there was, quite a strong narrative that made us think, well, why don't we take a look at this ourselves? So actually, prior to this paper, like a few years ago, we started to study this, our group, and we published a paper in which we showed that average daily consumption of our volunteers, who were 42 trained cyclists, that did not influence the performance-enhancing effects of caffeine. So, whether they were low users, moderate consumers, high consumers, the performance-enhancing effects seemed to be the same between all of them. In our study, we showed that it did improve endurance-based performance. We published these data with a bit of a provocative little title to get sort of people interested. And there's been quite a hot debate in scientific terms since. Some studies showing similar results to ours. Other studies maybe showing actually a reduction in the size of the performance benefits when individuals are habitual consumers. And so we've been working on a big study in this area for the last few years, but when COVID hit, we were kind of rather limited on what we could do in the lab. So we decided that what we could do to keep working in this area was provide an overview as to what the current literature suggests. And so what we decided to do was perform a meta-analysis on this topic. So we felt that could give us a nice overall indication of what the literature suggests and maybe help guide further work and recommendations in the area. So that's kind of how we got to this paper. A bit of a long-winded answer, but that's pretty much the overview of it.
No, that's perfect. That gives me a good background on kind of what led you guys into this. And another kind of question that I had for you is, like, what were your kind of expectations heading into this meta-analysis? And it sounds like maybe based on some previous research that you did, that maybe you expected that caffeine would still be effective even with habitual use, or what were kind of your expectations heading into this?
Yeah, exactly that. For us, because of within our lab, we'd already shown that there wasn't an influence. And then also, sometimes, anecdotal evidence from yourself kind of ekes into your own biases. So kind of, I know personally, I'm quite a a large caffeine user, but then I do, in the studies that I've performed with caffeine, I've always shown a performance benefit. So I was kind of inkling towards the side of, I thought that there might not be such a large influence of habitual consumption on the performance effects. But essentially, we didn't even know, how many studies we would get that could be included in this analysis. So it was all a bit exploratory as well.
Perfect. And that kind of leads us into what were kind of your methods of this study, or what was your kind of inclusion criteria? Just so people listening are clear, this wasn't necessarily like a standard single study to where you recruited participants and kind of went through that sort of thing. It was more of a meta-analysis to where you had a certain inclusion criteria and analyzed kind of other studies that kind of fit that inclusion criteria. So what was your kind of inclusion criteria, and what were your guys' kind of methods here?
Yeah, exactly that. As opposed to data collection where you have the people come into the lab, we decided to analyze what had already been done in the literature. And when it comes down to a meta-analysis, it is a lot of work. I think some people don't realize just how much work is involved. So, our first step was to just get a group together. For me, that was getting a group of capable students on board, kind of to do the heavy lifting, because there is a lot of work to be done. So that's where my students sort of came in. So Arthur Carvalho, who's the first author on the paper, Felipe Marchicorena, Beatriz Greco, and then Gabriel Barreto, sort of a really good group of students, a good bunch of students who I work with. So after defining the aim of the study, which was namely to see if habitual consumption of caffeine influences its performance-enhancing effects, kind of first step, you have to do a large search of the literature systematically. That means, using several search terms in different databases to ensure that you could get all the literature that's out there. And there is a lot of literature out there on caffeine. I think if I'm not wrong, there's close to 250, and that's kind of growing every day. So probably over 250 studies looking at caffeine's effects on exercise performance. But then one of our main inclusion criteria was that the studies had to have included a measure of habitual caffeine consumption of their participants, because, of 250 studies, not everybody then reports whether or not they're high users, low users, etc. So that was an important factor so that we could determine whether this habitual use is an influencing factor on the performance enhancing effects. So, after the initial searches, just to sort of give people an idea, returned about 8,000 papers. And then so 8,000 papers, kind of the students then have to look at the title and the abstract, that kind of overview of the paper, to see, does this paper kind of fit our criteria? Those we think it might, they're then brought forward to the next step, where they then have to read every single paper, or at least the methodology of those papers, to check, does it really fit the inclusion criteria? So namely, is there a trial with caffeine? Is there a trial with placebo, to make that comparison? And then have they measured exercise performance, and have they measured habitual caffeine consumption of the participants? So, they had to go through over sort of 300 specific papers. Again, about 250 of them were theoretically usable because they looked at caffeine's effects on performance. But then how many actually reported habitual consumption? Well, that actually was only about 25%. So the number of articles that actually ended up being included in our overall analysis was 60. So 60 studies specifically sort of had some kind of measure of the habitual consumption or caffeine consumption of the individuals. And that meant that then we could go and run some statistics on these, which was expertly performed by Gabriel Barreto. And actually 60 studies with some with a few different number of outcomes is actually quite a large and reasonable number for a meta-analysis as well.
Just a couple follow-up questions there. So for these studies that had habitual caffeine intake, did they kind of define that any further, or what was maybe classified as habitual caffeine intake? Like, is that, consuming caffeine for the last several months, or was that a little bit abstract and they didn't really define that a whole bunch, or kind of what does that look like?
Yeah, there's no particularly good consensus, I would say, in the literature about what is habitual consumption. And then, I guess from one point of view, if you're taking a little bit of caffeine every day, then it's habitual. It doesn't matter whether it's this much or this much. If it's every day, it's habitual. But then, you get into the nuances. So, well, what is, moderate? What is high? What is low? And certainly, a few authors have tried to potentially suggest thresholds for this. So maybe people who are ingesting less than 25 milligrams per day might be considered caffeine naive, because you might just get tiny little bits in, some food sources, but you're not actively searching it out. Maybe low consumption might be that one coffee where you might be getting up to about 75 milligrams a day, but no more. And then, above a threshold of about 6 milligrams per kilogram of your own body mass, so we generally kind of put it relative to individuals, might be considered sort of above that dose, might be considered quite high. But again, there's no black and white. There's no, support to say, well, this kind of habitual consumption will potentially generate a habituation in that person, any kind of tolerance in that person. So it's quite difficult to define. But the good thing about it as well is that we can just use it as continuous data. And what I mean by that is, you don't have to say low, moderate, and high, because there are actually some different studies saying low, moderate, and high, but with different amounts in those three groups. But if you just say, well, this group is taking on average 25 milligrams per day, this group 100 milligrams per day, this group 150, then you can kind of model it using just that continuous data rather than putting them into boxes. And so that's what we try to do in our study here.
Gotcha. Makes sense. So not super defined, but also still means that, they had some sort of like daily intake of caffeine of some extent.
Well, I guess as well here, for the purposes of our research as well, we included those studies that suggested that people were completely naive or had none. I think it's potentially unlikely that they had 0, but as close as. But that's what we also wanted, because we kind of want to know, well, so are those people who are taking pretty much nothing, are they getting a bigger effect when they're taking caffeine pre-exercise to those people who have moderate, high amounts in their daily diet, and that same dose is given? Is there any difference? So that's kind of what we wanted to look at and explore here.
Gotcha. And then all the individuals were doing some sort of exercise training program, and they were measuring that exercise. Was it a certain type of exercise that you guys were looking at, or just some sort of measurement of strength, hypertrophy, power, something like that?
The first point to consider there is that not specifically all our participants, or all the participants from the different studies were considered trained. That kind of trained bracket is quite broad as well. But I kind of agree with you. We generally define that as, somebody who's involved in a kind of specific training regimen. And most studies will at least report whether people are trained or not trained. But then, there's a difference between, sometimes in my life, I've considered myself fairly trained, but I'm by no means a professional, an elite athlete, etc. So, there's different brackets. So we kind of, based upon descriptions in the paper, we separated according to untrained individuals. So that might be people maybe physically active, but not specifically involved in a training program with, a specific goal of competing. And then the other group were trained individuals. And we didn't separate according to subgroups because it was quite difficult based upon the terms used. If I'm not mistaken, I think within the studies, there were 3 kind of studies that used elite athletes, at least in their words. But to then do a sub-analysis on only 3 subgroups is a bit difficult. So we just put all of them together. So at least we can see, well, the people who are more trained, do they have a bigger or smaller effect than people who are less trained? And then your question about sort of the type of exercise, there's all kinds. So the literature is awash with studies on endurance, studies on strength and resistance exercise, and power, kind of like, like explosive sprints. So generally what we try to do is we'll perform a general analysis on everything. So we'll put it all in there. Is it a marathon, or is it a 30-second sprint, or is it sort of a one repetition max? We'll put it all in there together, and we'll see what the overall message says. And then afterwards, depending on numbers, we'll try to separate. Well, okay, let's try to look at only the endurance. Let's try to look at only the strength and power and resistance exercise activities. Let's look at only those explosive power activities. Now, is there a different effect between these ones now? And so that's what we were able to do as well in our study here.
Perfect. Well, I think those are all the follow-ups I have on your methods here. So now to kind of get to the good stuff, so to speak, what did you guys find here? What were your results?
So yeah, we did quite a few analyses. So bear with me on that one. So like I said, we did the first overall analysis. So putting all the studies in there. Again, off the top of my head now, I can't remember the number of outcomes that we had, but essentially, so putting all those exercise outcomes together, we showed a small but positive effect of caffeine on exercise performance. Okay, and that's generally what is shown in the literature. People might say, oh, it's only a small effect, but what are you expecting? It's almost in the name. It's a supplement. Of course, you're going to have a bigger effect if you go from doing no training to training. But, caffeine might be that little icing on the cake to help you train a little bit better. And so when we adjusted this for habitual caffeine consumption, this showed that there was no influence of that habitual caffeine consumption on the outcomes. So kind of in simple terms, it didn't matter what the level of your habitual caffeine consumption. If you were a low consumer, very naive consumer, a moderate consumer, the higher end of the consumers, the data overall suggested that performance improvements can be expected, and the size of those effects are the same, essentially, irrespective of your habitual caffeine intake. So I think that's sort of the main message. But then again, like I said, so we could separate into those subgroups of kind of endurance, strength, power activities. I think sort of your podcast and your listeners are more kind of the strength and resistance exercise interest group. And so again, within that subgroup, there was a small beneficial effect of caffeine, and habitual caffeine consumption didn't influence that effect. So those who do have high caffeine consumption shouldn't be particularly worried, according to these data, about not getting a performance boost from caffeine pre-exercise. And likewise, the endurance athletes, and likewise those kind of more explosive, maybe sprint power athletes. A few other smaller analyses that we did, well, not necessarily smaller, but we looked at were there differences between men and women. It seems not. Were there differences between trained and non-trained? It seems not. So again, they get their benefit, and the benefit, the size of that benefit is pretty similar. And then maybe the last kind of two big analyses to highlight, I would say. So because of this narrative that habitual consumption might influence caffeine's effects, some suggest that, well, if you're taking 100 milligrams of caffeine per day, then you need more than that pre-exercise to then get a benefit. So, if you're having 3 cups of coffee, then you need at least 3 cups of coffee or more to get a beneficial effect. If you take less than that, then you won't. That's kind of the thought behind it. And I think, it's fairly logical to think that as well. So we kind of separated studies into those who gave a pre-exercise dose of caffeine that was lower than the individual's habitual caffeine consumption, and the others that gave a dose that was higher. So if that's true, then maybe those taking the lower dose would not get such a big benefit or no benefit at all compared to those taking the higher dose. But again, no difference. So regardless of whether the dose was lower or higher, it seemed to affect performance. So again, kind of further supporting that fact that habitual caffeine consumption maybe doesn't influence caffeine's performance effects that much. And then, the final analysis that we performed. So again, many people, because of this, recommend withdrawing from caffeine in the days maybe prior to competition. That competition day is important. You want caffeine to work. You want it to have its best effects. So stop taking it for a few days beforehand, because then you'll supposedly lose that withdrawal effect, is, again, the theory behind it. So to see if this influenced results, we separated studies that had withdrawal periods. So we kind of grouped them into three. Those that had less than 24 hours, so essentially almost no withdrawal really from caffeine. So if there is an influence, you'd expect this group to have the lowest benefits because they've had no caffeine withdrawal. 24 to 48 hours, and then above 48 hours. So again, you'd expect the largest improvements in that group if there is an effect of withdrawal. And the results, again, no difference. So all showed similar performance effects with regardless of how long caffeine was withdrawn from in those participants. So, summarizing everything that I've just said there, I think the data doesn't support habitual caffeine consumption having an important effect on caffeine's kind of performance enhancing benefits when you take it prior to an exercise bout.
One kind of important thing that you covered there was that a lot of people, even in bodybuilding circles, when they're leading up to their, or maybe in a deload week, so reduce volume, reduce training, they might completely cut caffeine out just to kind of make themselves potentially a bit more sensitive to it, or at least that's kind of the logic behind it. And then as they go through their training program, as they get into their kind of final weeks of training, they'll end up scaling their caffeine intake up with their training intake, like larger and larger pre-workouts as they get into those kind of final weeks of training. But based on your guys' study here, it sounds like that's potentially not really needed, as that kind of cycling of caffeine or coming off of it and coming on it doesn't seem like it really leads to much of a greater effect when it comes to someone's performance or exercise or anything like that. Does that sound correct?
Exactly. I do think when it comes down to it, if you're happy coming off coffee or whatever your caffeine, whatever your caffeine source, if you're happy doing that for a while and you don't have kind of withdrawal effects, because some of us know there are potential withdrawal effects of headaches and lethargy, etc., then by all means go for it. But the data don't suggest that it's necessary.
Perfect. And based on your results here, to me, it sounds like they probably, for the most part, matched your expectations kind of heading into things, to where not seeing much of a difference with habitual intake. Were there any results that kind of surprised you, or were they pretty in line with what you were expecting heading into it?
No, yeah, you're spot on. I think for me, it followed what I expected. You kind of think almost a little bit too perfectly sometimes, but I think to add a little bit of nuance, because it is, it's a meta-analysis. There are data out there that do suggest the opposite. So sometimes I do think, people jump on board and will go, oh, you see, throw all the other stuff that shows the opposite out the window. Well, no, not at all, because there's some fantastic evidence out there to suggest that, well-run studies showing that there is some kind of tolerance. But I guess the question is, at what dose does that build up? For how long? A question you asked earlier, how long can you be considered habituated? I think that's another question we don't know. For how, after what moment does potential tolerance occur? We don't really know. And then a lot of the studies in this paper relied on people's reporting of their own caffeine intakes, via coffees and teas and things. If you want to tell me what you ate and drank yesterday in exact detail, I think you'd probably struggle. I struggled with what I had for breakfast. So, and then you're saying, okay, well, there's this amount of caffeine in your food, which is an estimate, again, because the amount of caffeine in our foods and drinks we know is so variable from day to day, from brand to brand, within brands. So it is all a bit sort of using averages, and so a little bit of caution is always good, I think. But then that being said, those studies that do show a potential tolerance doesn't show that sort of that performance enhancing benefit is eliminated. So it's just maybe a slightly smaller benefit. But again, I think that's why we're trying to do a few studies here, just to see, well, what exactly is it? Do we need that slightly higher dose, or what exactly is potentially causing a tolerance or not? After how long does it occur, etc. So it's a difficult topic. It's an interesting topic. For now, I would say the data suggests that just keep on going the way you're going. There's no real big benefit from removing it from your diet.
Absolutely. And my bias is like wanting to believe that strongly. It's like, I like having caffeine. I want to keep consuming it. I don't want to come off it and experience like withdrawals. So like, full disclosure, this definitely feeds into kind of my own personal bias here. But I think that those kind of caveats and nuances that you mentioned there are really important, as like you mentioned, self-reporting of dietary intake has historically been known to be pretty kind of hit and miss and pretty inaccurate. Even in, I think there's studies in which like registered dietitians, even when they self-report their nutrition, it's actually not super close. And then also with like nutrition labels having like up to 20% variability in what like is actually in the label, and variation between like, if someone has an 8-ounce cup of coffee, if it's from this certain brand, it might have 100 milligrams of caffeine, but if it's from this brand, it might have a little bit less or a little bit more. So there's a kind of ton of variation there. And like you said, we are kind of just looking at on average what we kind of think the trend is going. So, it's not to say that this is the be all end all, but it does sound like the totality of the evidence does point in the direction of kind of habitual caffeine intake not really making a big difference in performance for exercise.
Yeah, I think sometimes looking at the extremes is the best way of getting a good idea as well. Because, okay, if you're going to say, well, there's probably a lot of variation in the quantities, but if you're looking at people who pretty much don't drink coffee, tea, and have caffeine sources, and then you're looking at those people on the other end of the scale who are having 5, 6, 7, 8 cups of coffee a day, well, let's look at this. And you see, the performance benefits are the same. Well, that gives you a pretty good picture of, okay, well, maybe it's not as important as we think. And I think that's one of the big messages from our paper, I think.
Absolutely. Well, are there any kind of final takeaways you want to leave the listeners with regarding kind of habitual caffeine intake, or even caffeine intake in general? I know you've done, other research on this topic. So any kind of final takeaways, and maybe even more so for the person focused on resistance training and strength training, anything that you want to just wrap up on?
Well, I'm wary of going down some rabbit holes, so I'll try to keep it light and simple. I think my suggestion would be, for those who maybe haven't tried it, give it a go. In terms of using it as a pre-workout, give it a go and see how you react. There's lots of data to suggest that it can improve performance during strength exercises, increased repetitions, volume, intensity, rate of force development. So, all of that can, be of benefit to those people, whatever your goals with your strength and resistance exercise regime. If you want to take it as that espresso or cup of coffee pre-exercise, then great. It might, you don't know exactly how much you're getting. Recommended doses generally are quite high. So if we say that maybe 70 milligrams is in an espresso, say for me, I would need 3 espressos to have kind of that 3 milligrams per kilogram of body mass amount, which is kind of what's recommended in the literature. So sometimes just buying some capsules with 200 milligrams of caffeine in them, take it 45 minutes to an hour pre-exercise, pre-workout, and see how you get on. If you don't like it, if you feel get a bit of side effects or get a bit anxious or jittery, then maybe it's not for you. If you feel it helps, then great, continue taking it, employ it how you want. If you want to be really rigorous, try the same session with and without and see if you do better. But I think it's one of those supplements that's certainly potentially worthwhile giving it a go.
Perfect. And I would say the biggest hang up that I'll say on caffeine, or the biggest kind of potential side effect that people run into, is when it starts influencing their sleep and impacting their sleep. So like you said, I think it's like 3 milligrams of caffeine per kilogram of body weight is kind of like the recommended, effective dose, about 45 minutes to 60 minutes before training. But if you're training at 5 or 6 p.m. at night and you take 3 milligrams of caffeine per kilogram, you could very well have a good amount of caffeine in your system when you actually try to go to bed, and it might impact sleep. And as we all know, sleep has a large effect on your performance in the gym and the results that you're going to get there. So I'll just, with everything we've said here, caffeine, I use it and kind of do the whole caffeine thing, but I also tend to really cut my caffeine off earlier in the day, several hours before I want to go to bed. So just wanted to make that one kind of caveat there.
No, I think that's a good point, a relevant point, because there are, we've had volunteers who we've even given them caffeine in the morning, and then we've gotten messages from them at 3 a.m. the next night saying like, I can't sleep. It's like, sorry. So there are some people who really are sensitive to it and can't get a good night's sleep. So again, I think that all factors into, give it a test. Maybe one night's bad sleep, try it again. If it's continuous, then yeah, maybe really only in the morning, or maybe not at all. It depends on the person, I think.
Perfect. Well, if people want to stay up to date on the research you're doing, is there any good places they can go to kind of follow you and stay up to date with that? I know a lot of the researchers I have on, they're like not really active on social media at all. So I'm not sure your activity out there, but is there anywhere that they can kind of go to follow you?
So yeah, in terms of kind of Instagram, I'm not particularly, I don't put much on that's work related. I mainly spam people with photos of my son. But I do use Twitter a fair bit to kind of try to promote our work. So if I'm not wrong, I'm at bicycle_Bryan. That's Bryan with a Y. And so there I generally try to promote the work that me and my group are doing. So I think that's potentially the best place to find my research, or even look on ResearchGate. ResearchGate's a great site to find different research from different researchers. So those two places probably best.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for coming on today, Bryan. I definitely learned a lot, and I'm sure my audience did as well.
Great. Thanks a lot, Ryan.